Dear colleagues, my name is Roman Nekulak, and I work for the Center for Civil Liberties. Today, we host our second seminar provided with the support and advice of PLPG, Public International Legal, Public International Law and Policy Group. First seminar was delivered by Dr. Noone almost a semester ago, and it concerned the issue of introduction to IHL, International Humanitarian Law. Today, we will tackle the other subject, much more complicated, much more disputable. We will speak about killer robots, drones, artificial intelligence, and the future of warfare, and how battlefield in Ukraine define this legal and technical process. This webinar will be recorded, and you will be able to revisit certain reasoning in the future on our YouTube channel, as well as our previous webinars on IHL and international human rights law. I will send all relevant links to a chat below. It is important to mention that PLPG is a CCL partner on various occasions, including on research, advice on IHL. And it is our big honor to invite Mr. Noone today to give his presentation. If you have questions for Mr. Noone, you can write them directly into the chat, or you can raise your hands at the end of the webinar and voice them by yourself. Otherwise, I will do it for you. Mr. Noone, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Roman, and thank you everyone for being here today. As Roman said, my name is Dr. Gregory Noone, and I'm the Executive Director of the Public International Law and Policy Group. Public International Law and Policy Group, or PILPG, as we call ourselves. We've been engaged with our friends in Ukraine well before the full-scale invasion of February 24, 2022. We continue to be engaged with our friends working with various facets of not only the NGO community, and we're proud to have as partners the Center for Civil Liberties, but also with the government. In fact, week before last, I spent a week with 15 Ukrainian military lawyers working on targeting scenarios and the law of armed conflict that they face each and every day. So our relationship with our Ukrainian friends runs deep, and hopefully through lectures like this, we can answer any and all questions that you may have. A note on that, as Roman said, you can put it in the chat, you can raise your hand, feel free. I want this to be more of a conversation as opposed to me reading a script. This is a technical area though. So this time we decided to use a PowerPoint presentation. I'll ask my colleagues from PLPG to go ahead and put that up now, because there really is some fine technical matters that we have to deal with when we're speaking about lethal autonomous weapon systems and their compliance with international law. As Roman said, I had the pleasure of providing a lecture on the law of armed conflict, also known as international humanitarian law. It's really the same thing. What I've said in the past is that law, you can kind of tell who's speaking. Law of armed conflict is very much a military term, where international humanitarian law is often a term you'll hear academics or NGOs use, but it means the same thing. It means the same thing. So last fall, we kind of did more of an introduction to the law of armed conflict, and I think it's fitting now to be able to return and speak more in depth on a very topical topic such as autonomous weapon systems, especially with where Ukraine is today. All right, so with that being said, it's always worth a few minutes to review the fundamental principles of the law of armed conflict. They are military necessity, distinction, also known as discrimination, proportionality, and humanity and unnecessary suffering. The reason why it's important to go through these four is because everything we talk about with respect to an armed conflict are grounded in these fundamental principles. So these fundamental principles are how we get to the legal conclusions that we get to when we're evaluating particular weapons, and autonomous weapon systems, et cetera, are no different. They're evaluated the same exact way. So let's spend a few minutes here. First and foremost, military necessity. This allows us to defeat the enemy as quickly and efficiently as possible. But there's a big but here, and the but is that it's not prohibited by the law of armed conflict. So in other words, the military necessity allows you to go fight and win, but you cannot violate the law in doing so, okay? And it allows incidental harm to civilians that inevitably will result in for measures to defeat the enemy. But the fact of the matter is, you're not allowed to target civilians ever. You're never allowed to target civilians. So as we go through this, and as you think of scenarios that you want to ask me about, the fact of the matter is that you cannot target civilians. However, civilians that are part of the incidental harm to a proper military attack will fall under the category of proportionality, which we'll speak about in just a minute. What's interesting about military necessity is the idea that this is actually a permissive body of law. If this was a restrictive body of law that simply said, these are all the things you cannot do, then what would happen on the ground is the military commanders would say, well, I cannot accomplish my mission because of all these restrictions. So law of armed conflict is actually permissive, allows you to accomplish the mission, but there are some red lines, that there are some things that are prohibited, and we work within that space between what we're allowed to do to quickly and efficiently make the enemy submit as soon as possible and make sure we don't violate the law itself. The second fundamental principle is distinction, sometimes referred to as discrimination, really meaning the same thing. And there are actually two parts of distinction. I only put one part on here because it was a more relevant part. The other part is that you have the obligation to distinguish yourself as a combatant, distinguish yourself from the civilian population. So you have the requirement to distinguish yourself from the civilian population so that the civilian population is not brought into harm's way. The second part, and it's not necessarily a 1 and a 2, it's just there are two different parts. The second part is that when conducting an attack, we must distinguish between the armed forces and the civilian population. So in other words, between military objects and civilian objects. What's a military object? A military object is anything that helps the enemy achieve their mission. So it could be tanks, could be airplanes, could be ships, but it could also be if the enemy has seized SUVs and they're transporting their troops in SUVs, or they're transporting their troops in a yellow school bus, that then becomes a military object. Now, understand that we have to make sure that we're taking proper measures so that we understand who's in that SUV, we understand who's in that school bus. It's a lot easier when we see a tank or a military vehicle, it's a lot easier to simply say military object, target it. But there are other things that can be brought into the targeting spectrum here because of the use that the combatants have engaged with them on. Now, under this principle, the civilian population and other protected persons and objects may not be the object of attack. So as I said, you can never target, you can never purposely direct an attack against civilians or civilian objects. So distinction is a key requirement here in one of our fundamental principles. The third fundamental principle is this concept of proportionality. Now, this definition has a lot here, so I'll go and break it down bit by bit. Proportionality prohibits an attack on a military objective if the expected incidental civilian injuries, deaths, and property damage would be excessive in relation to the anticipated concrete and direct military advantage to be gained. I put those words in italics, expected, excessive, and anticipated, because these are difficult words. These can be very subjective, obviously relying upon intelligence. And so intelligence will always be the Achilles heel of any targeting scenario. Expected incidental civilian injuries, deaths, and property damage. Well, if you don't have the proper intelligence to tell you that there are civilians in the area, then you wouldn't expect any civilian injuries. So how can you then go to the next step of determining whether or not that expected civilian deaths would be excessive in relation to the anticipated concrete and direct military advantage gain? So there's a lot there. And one example that I often give is we were in the first Gulf War, we, the United States, were targeting a clear military objective. It was a military facility surrounded by guards, a fence, guard towers. Only military were going in and out of that facility. And so we decided to target it as a proper target. What we didn't know is that at night, about 250 civilians were going in there and using it as a bomb shelter. We didn't know that. So our expected civilian deaths was 0 because we had failure in intelligence that we didn't know there would be any civilians in there. So understand that intelligence will always be the Achilles heel in what we're looking at. In addition, feasible precautions must be taken in planning and conducting attacks so that we can reduce the risk of harm to civilians and other persons. Okay. Somebody put in the chat, can we now say something about which errors can cause more damage to the civilian population? The human factor, the application of AI, drones, software. Oleg, let's put a pin in that. And what I mean by that is let's hold off on that. We will most definitely get to that because that is an absolute issue here when we talk about whether or not, when we talk about that balance in autonomous weapon systems, when we talk about that balance as to whether or not the error is a human error or the error is a programmatic software error. And with that said, it may not just be a programmed error. It may be an error in the software because the equipment is damaged, or maybe the equipment has been hacked by the enemy or by others that could cause the software difficulties. But we'll circle back to that, Oleg. That's a great question. Okay, the fourth fundamental principle is humanity/unnecessary suffering. I group these together. Sometimes when you look at the fundamental principles and the law of armed conflict, you'll see people saying there are 5 or 6 or 7 because they kind of extenuate. And I like to keep it simple and that there are 4. And because I think humanity and unnecessary suffering really is saying the same thing. It forbids the infliction of suffering, injury, or destruction unnecessary to accomplish a legitimate military purpose. And it prohibits the intentional attack upon the civilian population or an incapacitated enemy combatant, or the intentional destruction of civilian property not being used for military purposes. So all of these 4 principles are critical. And as we start looking at the weaponry themselves, this is important to keep in mind, because this is the law. This is what tells us what we need to know. Okay. All right. So what are autonomous weapon systems? What weapons are classified under the definition of this acronym LAWS, LAWS, lethal autonomous weapon systems, and what's the current state of deployment, of development, or deployment. Okay, there's no clear internationally accepted definition, and you'll see on the next slide where the International Committee of the Red Cross defines autonomous weapon systems as those that can independently select and attack targets with the autonomy and the critical functions of acquiring, tracking, selecting, and attacking targets. That's a lot there. So let's look at what the US Department of Defense says. A weapon system that once activated can select and engage targets without further intervention by a human operator. This includes human supervised autonomous weapon systems that are designed to allow human operators to override operation of the weapon system, but can select and engage targets without further input after activation. All right, AWS is not artificial intelligence and never contains human-like qualities. In other words, these are not killer robots. Okay, and we'll get back to the human-like qualities, and we can talk about the definition of artificial intelligence as well. But okay, let's go to the next slide. And so, in other words, these lethal autonomous weapon systems are special class of weapons that use sensors and computer algorithms to independently identify a target and employ an onboard weapon system to engage and destroy it. They are weapons that can select and engage targets without human intervention. But the definitions are grounded in the amount of human engagement in the target selection and engagement. So importantly, as I said, this is not artificial intelligence. This isn't they don't have the capacity to have human qualities such as consciousness, emotion, sociability, semantic understanding, all required for human moral decision-making. So this is not artificial intelligence, and this is not a Terminator science fiction movie scenario that's going to take over the world. The fact of the matter is that that these concepts are more related to the term automatic. An automatic robot carries out a pre-programmed sequence of operations or moves in a structured environment. So think those little things that you may see commercials for on the internet, the little Roomba vacuum cleaner robots that go around the house and vacuum the house. Those are pre-programmed in a structured environment. Another example would be most cars today are painted by robotic machinery that knows how to paint a car and put the paint in the right place. Again, a pre-programmed sequence of operations in a structured environment. Whereas autonomy is about machines operating without human control. The weapon just needs a sensor or a way to process sensor information to activate their payload. There are three types of weapon systems, and they're generally described as follows. The first is human in the loop, or sometimes referred to as semi-autonomous systems. And these require a human to direct the system to select a target and attack it, such as a Predator or a Reaper unmanned aerial vehicle, sometimes referred to as a drone. Drone, I think, is a bit of a misnomer. Everyone uses it now, but the fact of the matter is a drone makes it sound like it's stupid, when really these are unmanned aerial vehicles, to be more precise. This is operated by somebody maybe thousands of miles away, operating a joystick and circling a target, selecting, making decisions, making human decisions. So there's a human in the loop. The second is referred to as a human on the loop, or human supervised autonomous systems. And these are weapon systems that select targets and attack them, albeit with human operator oversight. Examples include the Israel's Iron Dome. One that I'm more familiar with is the US Navy's Phalanx close-in weapon systems, or what we call CWIS. And the CWIS, which is pictured there, looks like a little R2-D2. And the CWIS is a defensive operation to defend a ship from missiles. The CWIS can fire a couple hundred rounds per second and can take down incoming missiles and protect the ship. So that is a human on the loop. So it's a human supervised. So when there's a missile indicated as inbound, they can flick the CWIS on, and the CWIS will take it from there. The third type of weapon system is a human out of the loop, or a fully autonomous weapon system without any human interaction. And this is where we're starting to get into these idea of frankly, closer to, not necessarily artificial intelligence, but closer to an autonomous system. That's what we call a fire and forget system, where you put it up and you let it go. Think as an example there that we put in our PowerPoint, these drone hunters. Think about these drone swarms that we've read about, maybe even seen, where the drones interact with each other, and they develop a swarm pattern after selecting a target. So that does not have a human coordinating and moving the swarm. That's all pre-programmed, and then it's autonomous from there. So look, I know there's a lot of conversation about this, but these have been around in history for a long time. Autonomous weapons have been a feature of warfare for centuries. During the American Civil War, they developed landmines made of sheet iron with a brass cap sealed in beeswax to protect the fuse. And when a soldier put sufficient pressure on the mine, it exploded. So in many ways, landmines are autonomous weapon systems. You put them in the ground and then you let them go. You don't have any control over them. Now, granted, there are some landmines that we have control, that we can self-detonate or that we can disarm remotely. But for the most part, these are essentially autonomous weapon systems. And that you put out there, and then they make their own decision. Now, the decision is triggered by someone putting pressure on the landmine itself. Of course, the Ottawa Convention banned anti-personnel landmines, but as we all know, landmines are still deployed, as are anti-vehicle and sea mines. Other munitions are these types of loitering munitions, where you sometimes have an unmanned UAV, excuse me, sometimes you have an unmanned aerial vehicle, as I said, a UAV, and a missile hovering above a battlefield and striking targets that meet various designations. Whereas the Navy Sea Whiz and the Israeli Iron Dome, forgive me, I have allergies. It's not quite springtime, but it's starting to get my allergies going. So there are various active defense systems that defend against incoming missiles. In the demilitarized zone between South and North Korea, South Korea has deployed, as this picture shows, the SGR-A1, which is a gun turret, which has a fully autonomous mode. So between the Sea Whiz and the Iron Dome and the SGR-A1, these are just a few examples of autonomous weapons. Okay, so what's the impact of autonomous weapons? While they're not exactly new, the idea of a completely autonomous weapon with the capacity to seek out its target and engage without human control creates fears among many scholars and practitioners. These fears relate to the lack of human control over the weapon and the ability to limit its effects, as well as whether or not the fear that these weapons may escalate the conflict further. In particular, I'd say using a fully autonomous weapon means the weapon is able to find, select, and fire upon targets without human intervention. So that weapon's programmed in a way that it can assess the context of the battlefield and decide whether and whom to attack. Some call it the third revolution of warfare. And the possession and use of such a weapon would offer significant advantages to any military. So for instance, autonomous weapons offer speed. Typical human takes 250 milliseconds to react to something they see, whereas an autonomous weapon can respond far faster. The Rheinmetall Defense's active defense system can react to incoming RPGs in less than 1 millisecond. So according to General George Murray, head of the U.S. Army's Future Command, that speed may be necessary to defend against massive drone swarms that I mentioned earlier. These weapons may be the difference between survival and defeat. Likewise, human error is common. Humans get tired, they get frustrated, maybe overconfident. There's always a self-preservation mode when you're out on the battlefield. These are things that you can remove when you're dealing with some of the autonomous weapon systems. But human error creates mistakes. There have been numerous examples where humans have unnecessarily caused loss of life. For instance, there was a deadly steam fire on board the USS Iwo Jima that killed 10 sailors. And the steam fire was caused because a civilian maintenance crew used a brass nut instead of a steel one on a steam valve. And so as a result, 10 U.S. Navy sailors died. And as a personal matter, one of them was a classmate of mine from university, who was a great naval officer. In the example I have on the slide, dealing with the USS Vincennes, in 1987, during the Iran-Iraq War, in which the US was supporting Iraq, there was another ship called the USS Stark that did not adequately identify a threat from an Iraqi fighter jet. The Iraqi fighter jet supposedly misidentified the Stark as an Iranian ship, highly unlikely, and as a result, launched two 1,500-pound Exocet missiles that impacted the ship, and 37 US sailors were killed. So take that information, the result of the Stark's underreaction error, and in the following year, a ship in the Persian Gulf, essentially patrolling the same waters, the USS Vincennes, had an overreaction of human error, and they shot down an Iranian civilian Airbus, killing all civilian passengers and crew. And so the human error there was that they started seeing essentially what we say seeing ghosts, where they looked at this aircraft and they saw it as in a descending attack profile, and that it was a military aircraft, when in reality, the computer was telling them that it was ascending, it was leaving, and it was a civilian profile. But the human error and being on knife's edge, knowing what happened to the Stark, that they started kind of seeing what they wanted to see, and as a result, the human error killed a lot of people. All right, as far as precision goes, precision is part of really an important part of one of the questions that we got ahead of time, was the difference between limited warfare versus total warfare. Whereas the autonomous weapon systems really could help us be more precise. A limited war obviously means that the military action is focused only on military objects. And in a limited war, the parties are to target combatants and military units, military objects only. Whereas on the other hand, in total war, civilians and civilian infrastructure also become a target of the military. An obvious example of this, of a total war, is in World War II, where civilian harm became part of the military goal. I will say this, that total war is prohibited under the law of armed conflict principle of distinction. In fact, you'll find very few scholars and practitioners that will agree with the concept of total war. In other words, targeting the civilian population. One of the things we talked about last fall was the list of the many war crimes that Russia is committing. And top among them is their indiscriminate targeting of the civilian population. There's a very strong belief that the Russians are doing that because they're trying to break the will of the Ukrainian people, and their will to fight, their will to defend their homeland. And the fact of the matter is that is not a legitimate target. The will and the morale of the people are not legitimate targets. They are civilians and remain civilians. And so parties need to distinguish between civilian objects and military objects and cannot target the former. Some critics of automated weapons argue that the use of such weapons risk technological error, whereby the weapon is not able to distinguish a combatant from a civilian or military unit from a group of civilians. At the same time, automated weapons can also improve aiming and reduce collateral harm if coded properly. For example, that I have on the screen, Israel reportedly used an autonomous machine gun to assassinate an Iranian nuclear scientist. We'll get into whether or not that was legal or not. That's not the point. But they did it without hitting the scientist's wife, who was only a few inches away. So it can really help guide us in speed, in removing human error, in being more precise. And all of those will, if done within the confines of the law of armed conflict, then you're perfectly legal. Okay. Now, ethical concerns are often discussed when it talks about autonomous weapons. We already mentioned the fear of technical error when it comes to the use of autonomous weapons. And there are many proponents of banning autonomous weapons, and they would argue that humans have moral agency and logical thinking when it comes to distinguishing combatants from civilians, whereas an autonomous weapon may be impacted by differences in color, maybe interference such as tree branches or weather, such as a foggy day. And as well as what I mentioned earlier, maybe its programming may be compromised either due to faulty or damaged equipment or by a cyber attack by an enemy or some other player. So although some states adopt robust verification and testing programs to increase reliability, others may not. And so as autonomous weapons are deployed in theater and in larger numbers, arms control advocates fear a higher likelihood of something going wrong. The reality of it is that no weapon is perfect, and there's always a chance of a weapon either malfunctioning or misfiring, and as a result, harm being caused to people that they shouldn't be harmed. Others are also raising concerns about the possibility of escalating the conflict, risking more civilian damage, because it may be easier to engage in armed conflict if it takes fewer humans to fight, as well as the fact it may be harder to escape a rogue weapon as opposed to humans. So the concept that if it perversely, we send fewer humans to war, maybe some countries will be more likely to go to war because they don't have to pay the human price, the domestic public opinion as to how many people are being killed or dying in such an armed conflict. If you can make it into a video game, people are less likely to object to the actual armed conflict taking place. But at the end of the day, in any armed conflict, people are going to be killed. And oftentimes, those people are civilians, either because they've been unlawfully targeted or because they fall under a proportionality analysis and they're listed as collateral damage, that the expected civilian casualties are not excessive in relation to the anticipated direct and concrete military advantage to be gained. So that analysis is undertaken. And just another point about proportionality, there's no metric where you say, well, one colonel is worth 5 civilians. There's no metric that tells us how many civilians exactly can be killed based on what your anticipated direct and concrete military advantage is gained. It's simply, really, frankly, we refer to it as art more than science, because you have to have all this information, all this data, all this intelligence brought in, and then the commander makes the decision at that point. Another argument that's been raised is also the idea of who will be accountable for autonomous weapon systems that commit a violation. And this kind of goes to Oleg's question a little bit. When there are errors that can cause damage, is it the human factor in the application, or is it something else? The reality of it is that I'm actually less concerned about who will be accountable for autonomous weapons committing law of armed conflict, because although on its face it looks like a point of contention, it really isn't. All lawyers in this conversation, as well as military practitioners, they agree that anyone who commits a law of armed conflict violation should be held accountable. And so it doesn't require special action or laws to be able to prosecute someone responsible for civilian deaths, whether those civilian deaths are caused by an AK-47, or whether they're caused by a drone, or whether they're caused by some other type of autonomous system. So in an autonomous weapons scenario, the person responsible may be the system programmer. Likewise, anyone in a superior command position who knew or should have known about the violation may be held accountable as well. So that's the concept of command responsibility. So even if the commander did not commit the war crime himself and did not order such a war crime to be committed, the fact of the matter is, if he knew or should have known about the violation, he or she can be held accountable. So there's always going to be someone who's going to be able to be held accountable in this scenario. Of course, the challenge is tracking who may have caused the harm or ordered the commission of the crimes using drones. But as we've seen, the technology today that's being exercised by Ukraine, but also by other NGOs such as Bellingcat, we've been able to track a lot of people. The New York Times did a fantastic piece on all the war crimes that were committed in Bucha, and by using CCTV, by using cell phone records, and these other things, and they were able to identify about 24 soldiers and commanders that were responsible for committing these war crimes, or at the very least were at the scene for committing these war crimes. And then, as I said, Bellingcat has identified some 30 plus soldiers and officers from the Russian military that are sitting comfortably in Moscow and St. Petersburg, I'm sure, are sitting there with their hot cup of coffee, far from the front lines, but they're the ones who are entering the target solutions into the missiles that are indiscriminately hitting civilian apartment buildings. So the fact that an NGO could identify 33 people as potential war criminals for failing to use proper distinction is really a phenomenal advancement in the use of technology from where we are today. So that will always be a challenge. Okay, legally, I'll say this right out of the gate. Generally speaking, autonomous weapons are not illegal per se. So while there's no clear-cut legal framework for regulating the use of fully autonomous weapons, making the legality of their use or abuse a little bit murky, the reality of it is that they're not illegal per se. Richard Moyes, who's the director of Article 36, which is a humanitarian organization focused on reducing harm from weapons, said that the danger is that there is not a bright line between where we are now and where we have accepted the unacceptable. So in a way, he's right that we don't know what the left and right limits are on the parameters here, and there's no one set international treaty governing the use of the autonomous weapons. There have been calls, at the UN toward a treaty to ban these weapons, but the reality of it is that there's been no substantial progress made. There was a meeting back a few years ago in 2017. A group of governmental experts we're tasked with examining the technological, military, ethical, legal dimensions of these weapons. And the reality of it is that their proposals to regulate these weapons really haven't gone anywhere. You have a number of countries that support it, but a number of the bigger countries like Russia, but also like the United States, that aren't supporting it. Those countries have argued that the law of armed conflict provides the regulations for the use of these weapons. In everything relating to war and the laws of armed conflict, autonomous weapons must observe the fundamental principles of the law of armed conflict: military necessity, distinction, proportionality, humanity. I know there's a question about the Martens Clause. Look, where there's no specific international legal framework regulating the conduct of warfare, parties are bound by the principles of international law. And that's really where the Martens Clause fits in. And the fact of the matter is, the law of armed conflict is robust, it is strong. And I make no mistake, the law of armed conflict is not perfect. There are going to be people that will die that should not die. But if you follow these principles, then you should be able to act in a way that it does not amount to a war crime while accomplishing the mission. It's really as simple as that. And as far as the law of armed conflict, we have a weapons review for all of the weapons that get put into play. So all weapon systems, any means of warfare, as opposed to a method of warfare, which methods of deployment and tactics, any means of warfare have to have a legal review conducted prior to formal development as a weapon and prior to any modification of an existing weapon, and another legal review prior to being deployed in the field. So these legal reviews used to come through my office in the Pentagon when I was the head of the International Law Department there. And these are very extensive and exhaustive legal reviews that are required by the law of armed conflict. So, and really at the end of the day, one of the reviews on these autonomous weapon systems is that these weapon systems must be able to distinguish combatants from non-combatants, as well as friend from foe. So the fact of the matter is that you're not going to get very far with any permission being granted if they can't do the most basic thing, which is distinction. As I said, the International Committee of the Red Cross have called for a ban, but the fact of the matter is that the U.S. And many other countries have said no. They're not into banning such weapons, but they're looking at regulating their use, particularly domestically. U.S. Department of Defense directive that was updated in 2023 states that autonomous and semi-autonomous weapon systems shall be designed to allow commanders and operators to exercise appropriate levels of human judgment over the use of force. In other words, keeping a human in the loop and be able to work through that system, or at the very least on the loop to work through that system. That these systems cannot be viewed in isolation, but considered in terms of a human system collaboration. In other words, all supervised by human operators at some level and designed to be readily understandable to those trained operators. That's an important part of all of this. The U.S. regulations require extensive testing, reviews, and management oversight for the approval of any such weapon systems. All right. So I've talked a lot, and I still have a little bit more to go. But are there any questions? Are there any questions? Any thoughts so far? And I'll take this pause just to take a sip to abate my allergies here.
Dr. Noone, you mentioned the obligation to review any new weapon that is developed, and I will give a direct link. It is prescribed by the Article 36 of Additional Protocol number 1, the Geneva Convention. But can you explain more about how Martens Clause works, and is it customary or it's a written source of law.
Say that again. I missed part of the middle of what you said, Roman. Can I explain?
The obligation to review new weapons is Article 36 of Additional Protocol 1. And what is Martin's clause? Because it was mentioned in a question list during registration, how these notions work in international law.
Yeah, so our argument is whichever way you want to view it, whether you want to view it as part of treaty law or customary international law, our argument in the United States is that it is clear that a weapons review is required under the law. We don't care how you agree with us, like I said, whether through treaty or through custom, but the reality of it is that it is the position of many countries that a weapons review is a requirement. It is not an optional. If you are going to develop and or deploy a weapon, you must go through a weapons review process where you make sure that that weapon is in accordance with the law of armed conflict. And that includes any modification. So if they're taking an existing weapon and modifying it, they have to go through that process as well. So hopefully that answers your question. Mikhailo, and I'm sure I'm saying your name wrong, so I apologize, raised the question, is it reasonable not to prohibit autonomous weapon systems outright, but impose certain restrictions related to mandatory human control on them? I think that's an excellent question. That's an excellent question, not only based in law, but based in political reality. There is not going to be agreement to ban these weapons outright. It's just not going to happen. We don't even know where these weapons have gone, where these weapons will go. The development just in the last 5 years has been phenomenal. So banning them outright, I don't see people essentially unilaterally disarming and stepping away from a potential game changer on the battlefield. However, I like your idea that there be mandatory human control, that there be a human in the loop or on the loop. I think that's something that I think could be argued for, and as a middle ground between those who want to ban the weapon and those who want to have their commanders and their operators exercise control, which is our position in the United States, to exercise control. So I think that's a great question. All right, Nicole, if you can put up the last 2 slides, I believe, and yeah, so as the slides indicate, there have been reported use of semi-autonomous weapons being used in Ukraine, both by the Russians and by the Ukrainians. Weapons have varying degrees of automation, but have some degree of human oversight, typically by remote control. And according to the Associated Press, there are no confirmed instances of a nation putting into combat robots that have killed entirely on their own. Now understand, robots can be useful at checkpoints where we have encountered in the last 20 years suicide bombers, and so they can be very useful in checkpoints. From a domestic law enforcement point of view, robots can be useful when clearing a house. So there are robots that have definitely been employed both domestically and in combat. But really, the benefits that I would emphasize of these type of weapons are increased precision and speed at which autonomous weapons can operate, and their potential for reducing collateral damage. So if we're talking about distinction proportionality, and you're telling me that this is a weapon system that can help us improve distinction and limit civilian collateral damage, then that's a system that we need to review. Of course, the International Committee of the Red Cross, they've published several reports raising significant ethical and moral concerns about the use and calling for their regulation. But I'll tell you, in October 2022, NATO released a plan aimed at preserving the alliance's technological edge in this area. So I don't see, like I said, unilateral disarmament, but as our colleague in the chat wrote, I do think that most states would agree that some human control over the weapons should be required, and not making them fully autonomous. So going back to Ukraine, obviously there's a lot of issues here, but there are some autonomous drones that are already being used to defend Ukrainian energy facilities from other drones. And this is where you're going to get into killer drones against killer drones. And some Ukrainian government officials have declared that these fully autonomous weapons might be used in the next 6 months. And Russia has made similar claims as well. And so beginning to employ such weapons could potentially have a massive impact on the course of the war. Okay, other questions, comments, thoughts? I know I put a lot out there. I think in sum, what I would say is that whatever the weapon is, has to be followed the law of armed conflict, military necessity, distinction, proportionality, humanity / unnecessary suffering. And so that analysis is the core analysis to whatever the weapon is. And at the end of the day, we're looking at whether or not these weapons, whatever we call them, semi-autonomous, autonomous, automated, that these weapons, in fact, are able to fit within the law of armed conflict fundamental principles. So go ahead, Roman.
Dr. Thank you for your excellent presentation, as usual. I will emphasize on what you say during your introduction, that IHL is more than just humanitarian aspects. It's also a balance between humanity and military necessity. And if military necessity dictates the need to implement laws, lethal autonomous weapon system during certain situation, it is indeed will become a crucial factor on the battlefield of future. But it depends on policymakers, lawmakers, to do this right, to give correct legal analysis of the situation, and to indeed implement efficient human control over algorithm decision making. And I would like to ask, what do you think about the possibility that lethal autonomous weapon system will trigger an arms race, because it is the only developed countries can implement and use this type of weaponry, and is it will eventually fuel the rise of private military contractors, private military businesses, because it is indeed a little bit of a gray zone, and there is various opinions on the subject. How can we prevent this arm race to happen?
Yeah, there's a lot there, and that's a great question. I hate to be pessimistic, but I think it's too late. I think every country in the world is working towards autonomous / automated robots and systems. We know that people are working towards artificial intelligence. So you're not gonna put that genie back in the bottle. Everybody's gonna continue working for that. I do find your last point of your question to be really relevant, is that sometimes there are contractors that are operating these systems, and what does that make of the status of the contractor? Well, if the contractor is operating a system that's delivering a payload, then that contractor is inserting himself into the hostilities, and that contractor is then targetable. So that's an issue that came up a lot in the last 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan with respect to the role of contractors. For the most part, the contractors that the U.S. employed, those were in self-defense and protection services, particularly for the U.S. Department of State. However, when contractors cross the line and engaged in hostilities, engaged in the armed conflict, they then become targetable themselves, and they're to be held accountable if they commit any war crimes in that manner. But yeah, Roman, unfortunately, I think it's too late. I think there are people everywhere in the world trying to develop this technology.
Understood. Yes, indeed, I agree. The other point that I would like to tackle, that the use of AI and robots could make it easier for political leaders to engage in use of force, because using such weapons would lower the risk of death of their own soldiers. And it will be a new way of conducting warfare, but at the same time, the point here is the implementing of this type of weapons will not prevent war of happening, but will fuel the arm race, will fuel the conflicts that happen in the world in the nearest future. So how civil society, how NGOs can influence policymakers or businesses in order to provide more control over the development, use, and application of laws.
Yeah, again, a lot of great stuff there, Roman. Obviously, Ukraine is fighting an existential threat and fighting for its life. So what I'm about to say does not apply to Ukraine. When you talk about other armed conflicts that are not self-defense, I mean, we can flip this, right? Russia engaged in an armed conflict when they did a full-scale invasion on Ukraine. That was a war of choice on their part. They were not in any way being threatened by Ukraine. They have no defense, self-defense argument that they can make there. So at the end of the day, it's doubtful that Putin is getting pushback because he's a dictator who runs a dictatorship. But in democracies where, and by the very definition of democracy, it's the consent of the people to be governed, democracies, rulers, leaders, presidents have to explain to their people why their sons and daughters are being sent somewhere and potentially dying. And so the idea that this makes it easier to go to war because, quote, less soldiers will be going, then that's problematic. So to your last point about the about what can NGOs do, I think NGOs continue to need to hold government's feet to the fire and pressure them for answers and transparency so that we're not stumbling off into a war that we don't need to stumble off to. I think 2003 in America is a perfect example when on the heels of 9/11, not enough people, not enough NGOs, not enough journalists held the government, the George W. Bush administration held their feet to the fire as to why we were going to Iraq. What was the purpose? What was the justification? What was the legal justification? And in retrospect, it was a mistake. And a lot of people in all different spheres in America admit their mistake, that they weren't forceful enough in making the government articulate why we were going off to war. So the last point I want to make on artificial intelligence, I'll hold on to it because Lisa has her hand up and I can circle back and make that point in a little bit. So Lisa, please, what's your question?
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Noone. This is really fascinating and informative, and I really enjoyed your, especially. We've mostly been about physical weapons, but I'm about the threat from non-physical cyber weapons, hacking, for example. Anonymous weapons can be hacked, possibly anonymously, so circumventing all laws, making war crimes less traceable.
Yeah, I mean, you're spot on. I mean, this is a concern of everyone, is that if you have a weapon system that can be hacked and then the result of that hacking is that it's directed against civilians and you have mass civilian casualties. You don't even need mass civilian casualties. You could have a civilian casualty because a weapon is targeted a civilian. And that's going to be problematic, not only for the deaths that occurs, obviously, but for how do we trace that? I mean, these are sophisticated hacking operations, particularly coming out of Russia. My concern, if I was running the drone program in Ukraine, my concern would be, how do I keep all those Russian hackers out of my system and causing damage to my automated weapon systems, autonomous weapon systems. So you're right about that. I'm not a cyber expert by any stretch of the imagination. And I always marvel at the cyber experts who very quickly are able to track down the source of a particular hack. In the United States, most of the commercials you see now, there's always commercials for recruitment for the military. It's just part of what our military does. We're constantly recruiting. It's an all-volunteer force. More and more of those commercials are directed towards cyber and directed towards this generation of young people that have grown up on tablets and computers and et cetera. And so that's where our military has gone to recruit the next generation of soldiers, is to invite all these kids, for lack of a better word, who have grown up on computers to come and join the good guys in order to beat back cyber attacks. So this will become a larger and larger part of every military's portfolio, to be sure. I hope that answers your question, Liza.
It does. Thank you very much.
Dr. Noone, I would like to ask a question about liability issues. It was a big part of your lecture, and I would like to emphasize how can we implement the doctrine of command responsibility or indirect responsibility to the use of this new type of weapons. And I would like to quote that the doctrine of command and force superior responsibility means that a superior, military or civilian leader can be held criminally responsible when his subordinates commit international crimes. This doctrine became part of customary international law and has been introduced into the statutes of international criminal tribunals and in Rome Statute of ICC itself, Article 28. So my question is whether the present current legal framework suited to use of laws, or it's inadequate to this type of weapons, and the fully autonomous weapon system will not be held accountable. So the military leadership can't be held accountable, or indeed the programmer, the manufacturer of such weapons will also be not held accountable. So there is a lack of understanding how it will be done in future, and what is your view on liability of laws?
So it's a great question, and there's a couple parts to the answer. I think we, and that's the royal we, the international community, Ukraine, our NATO allies, do a really good job of figuring out chains of command. And so if there's a unit that is using an autonomous weapon system, we're going to have a pretty good idea as to who is in the chain of command of that unit. We'll figure that out. So as far as figuring out who's responsible from a commander responsibility, I think I don't want to say it's easy. I don't want to oversell it, but I think we do a pretty good job of figuring out who's who and who's where. Now, the second piece, which is the less satisfying piece, is actually holding someone accountable. One of the things we talked about in the fall and on our last lecture was the idea that I personally don't believe that Vladimir Putin will ever end up in a courtroom somewhere, or Lavrov, anybody around him is going to end up in a courtroom. But I also don't believe that that many of these privates These lance corporals are going to end up in a courtroom. I think many of them are going to get shipped home, go back to their farm in Siberia, and never leave their farm. But it's the field grade officers, major, lieutenant colonel, colonel, that have so much impact and influence as to how a unit behaves on the field. Those field grade officers are going to be the ones that eventually want to take their family on holiday to Croatia. And the fact of the matter is that's when we're going to pick them up. Their name's going to be on a list when they try to cross the border. So we need to continue to do what we do through our respective intelligence agencies, through our respective NGO networks. PILPG is working with a couple of Ukrainian NGOs, and we've taken over 700 victims and witness statements from Ukrainians who have been impacted by the war. And a lot of them are very detailed. They can tell us that this Russian unit was there because we saw the numbers on the vehicle. They can tell us that DPR unit was there, or that Chechens were there. And so this is very important in establishing who was where when. And so I think we'll continue to put together this massive puzzle, and we'll figure out, and eventually we'll have names on the list. Look, this is going to take a long time when we talk about accountability. They just started, literally just started a trial for a Rwandan at The Hague. That happened in April of 1994. And, you know, here we are in April of 2023, and we literally just started a trial. So the accountability piece sometimes can be less than satisfying, can be definitely very frustrating. But one thing we know for sure, it is definitely a long process. So we'll continue to put together who's who and what they've done. Weapons aren't out there by themselves. Somebody put that weapon into the air. I mean, you always see these videos of the guys launching a drone, and it's like, you know, like throwing a ball. They just kind of like throw it and the drone takes off. Somebody put that in the air, and somebody's operating it, and somebody programmed it, and we'll figure out who they are.
Dr. Noone, thank you. And if you allowed another question, so
Yeah,
historically speaking, there was times during First and Second World War when new weapons and new tactic were implemented. During Great War, there was chemical warfare. During Second World War, the atomic bomb was created, and both weapons are extremely efficient on how much destruction they can bring. But during the time, there was no safeguards that have the ability to understand the human cost and military necessity. And this time, during 21st century, when laws are being developed, how can we ensure that military necessity will not overcome the humanity principle, the principle of human compassion and protection of civilian life? Because as a previous example, laws are extremely efficient, but behind this efficiency, how to remain a civilized country, civilized army?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the reality of it is that the law of armed conflict, like many laws, including domestic laws in your country and mine, are reactive. So there's usually a massive cataclysmic event like World War I, and then we reflect upon and react to where were the deficiencies. Chemical warfare. World War I, another deficiency was treatment of prisoners of war. So we worked through the 1920s developing international treaties to account for that. World War II, obviously another cataclysmic event. And so then we worked through the 1940s and 50s and onward to create the new treaties that would react to what happened. When you read the 1949 Geneva Conventions, in many ways, they're a laundry list of what the Nazis and the Japanese did. I mean, the 4 Geneva Conventions dealing with civilians, the law of occupation, is really looking at what the Nazis and the Japanese did to the civilian populations that they had control over. So unfortunately, like many laws, it's reactive. We don't have enough people looking over the horizon. In this case, we talked about there are people trying to look over the horizon, but I think they're going too far. Unlike our friend Michaelo said in the chat, they're trying to ban the weapons, when really maybe if they search for that middle ground, which was a mandatory human control, they could have more success. So like any political conversation, and remember, law is politics. And like any political conversation, you're going to have extremists on both ends. And we need to figure out that sweet spot in the middle that allows us to make progress on the laws that we need to make progress on. Let me just read something real quick here about artificial intelligence, because I know we've kind of said it, but artificial intelligence, much like how I began when I talked about autonomous weapons, really the problem is the terminology. Nobody really agrees on the terminology. So let me give you the U.S. Department of Defense definition on artificial intelligence. Any artificial system that performs tasks under varying and unpredictable circumstances without significant human oversight, or that can learn from experience and improve performance when exposed to data sets. An artificial system developed on computer software, physical hardware, or other context that solves tasks requiring human-like perception, cognition, planning, learning, communication, or physical action. So, you know, this is when we talk about artificial intelligence, this is something that learns, whereas the autonomous weapons don't learn. They are programmed, they know what they're supposed to do. Now, whether or not they're human in the loop, on the loop, or out of the loop, they're programmed a certain way. They don't learn. And that's what AI basically does. AI learns. For many of you who've used the chat GPT AI and writing your latest email or letter of recommendation, hopefully you're not writing your latest term paper with it, but you know, you put in just a little bit more and it learns, and it gets better and better and better, and it learns, it continually learns. That's what AI is. These weapons that we've talked about today, none of them are AI. That's not what's happening out there. They're autonomous, they're automated, but they're not artificial intelligence.
Dr. Noone, thank you. And before we revisit LOAC question, I would like to say to the audiences, please, you can ask your question interactively right now. Otherwise, we will go to a question in the chat. Oleg asked, which errors can cause more damage to the civilian population, the human factor in the application of AI drones, or errors in the software? So basically, what bring more suffering, humans or problems that may occur within AI?
Well, you know, we're lawyers, so our favorite answer to everything is it depends. Right now, what we've seen is human error kills more people. But I'm sure if somebody plays this recording back 20 years from now, they may laugh at my answer, or maybe 40 years or 100 years, they may laugh at my answer because it's program error that kills people. You know, in the United States, there's a show on one of the many TV channels we have, and it's called How Planes Crash. And they do an analysis into the investigation of when a plane crashes. And I find the show fascinating. My wife absolutely hates it. But I find the show fascinating because of the investigation that they undertake. And invariably what they discover on why a particular plane crashed, it's not because the pilot said, oh, and crashed the plane. It's usually a series of events, and they're all very small. And they're all a series of human errors. And then ultimately the plane crashes. I gave the example of the using brass nuts instead of steel nuts. There's more to that story. Somebody had put the nuts in the wrong container. So they had different containers for brass nuts and steel nuts, and somebody put the nuts in the wrong container. And so the workman reached in the container, pulled it out, and put the nuts on. Those nuts weren't supposed to be in that container. And so that's a human error. Somebody putting the nuts, nuts and bolts, putting the nuts into the wrong container. And then the human putting the nuts onto the valve and not recognizing, that, I mean, clearly a difference between steel and brass, and not recognizing. So human errors are always going to win that argument, at least in the time being. Maybe someday it's programmable errors. We see it from time to time in the United States, and I'm sure other countries see it, and I'm sure Ukraine has seen it. There'll be a recall on a motor vehicle, on a car. And cars now are basically big computers. And sometimes that recall is because of some computer programming error. But more often than not, that recall is a faulty part that was made by humans that is continuing to fail and causing problems. So I think human errors will be in the lead.
Noone, thank you for your presentation, and we remain in contact with you and your team for PLPG, Public International Law Policy Group, for further seminars, webinars on IHL. And dear guests, thank you for asking interesting and engaging questions. And a small reminder that starting from tomorrow, you can revisit the video recording on our YouTube channel, and you can look again on Dr. Noone reasoning in your research in future. Thank you very much, and we're done for today.
Hey, Roman, I want to say thank you to you and the Center for Civil Liberties. Thank you for everyone who showed up today and who watches us in the future, and know that we stand with the people of Ukraine and continue to do all we can to help you secure your victory for your freedom and your democracy. So hang in there, and we'll continue to support you in any way we can. So thank you.
Message well received. Thank you, sir. Thank you.